Most of my working life comes down to a single question. Not what a fish sees, not what a lure looks like in a photograph, what a fish actually detects, chemically, the instant something edible enters the water. So let me tell you about a man who spent decades ignoring the answer. He had fished his whole life. His grandfather swore by one bait, and he had filed it away as an old man's superstition. Never tied it on, not once, across an entire career on the water. The day he finally did, he landed more fish in a single morning than he had any right to. And the only thing he said about it afterward was that he felt foolish for waiting so long. The bait was a boiled noodle, a piece of macaroni, off a grocery shelf, for less than the coins in your cup holder. Now, the internet is full of people who will tell you that noodle is magic. It isn't. What it is a real chemical signal, with real science underneath it, that the tackle wall has never had one commercial reason to explain to you. Stay with me, and you will know exactly why it works, exactly why it got quietly forgotten, and why half the country is convinced it was banned, and exactly how to fish it, without burning a trip finding out. Here is the first thing the wall will not tell you. Macaroni is not new, and it is not a gimmick somebody invented for a thumbnail. It is old. It is a forgotten bait, the kind that sits in the same dusty drawer as bullock's pith and boiled potato. Baits that caught fish for generations and then simply fell out of the conversation. Go back to 1917. A man named Jim Baisley, twice an All-England match champion, in 1909 and again in 1926, wrote up the use of macaroni on a large treble hook. This was not a poor man's last resort. This was a champion telling other serious anglers that a boiled noodle belonged in the kit. In the English coarse fishing tradition, roach, bream, carp, pasta baits were ordinary, respected even. And it was not only England. For a long stretch of the last century, on plenty of American banks, what went on the hook came out of the kitchen: corn, dough, bread, pasta. Not because people were desperate, because it worked, and it was already in the house. That knowledge moved the way real knowledge used to move. One angler to the next, no packaging required. So what happened to it? It did not get disproven. Nobody ran a study that killed it. Something quieter was done to it. It got forgotten. And to understand how a bait that works just disappears, you have to stop thinking about fish for a second and think about shelves. Picture the wall of any tackle shop. Every single thing hanging on it shares three traits. It can be patented, or at least branded. It can be sold to you again next season because it wears out, dries up, or gets snagged off. And it earns its peg. It holds retail space because it returns a margin. Now hold a box of elbow macaroni up against that wall. You cannot patent it. You cannot sell a man the same grocery box every spring. He already has pasta in the cupboard. And it will never, ever earn a peg because there is no version of it that makes anyone money twice. This is not a conspiracy. Nobody locked macaroni in a vault. The American Sport Fishing Association puts the average angler's yearly spend right around $1,000. Call it $1,040. An entire economy runs on that number, and that economy has no reason on earth to point you toward the one bait it cannot sell you. The market did not bury this. It just never had a line item for it, which leaves the only question that actually matters. If nobody is selling it, why does the fish still want it? For that, you have to go inside the fish's mouth, and it is stranger in there than you think. Open your hand and imagine the skin on your palm could taste, not touch, taste. Imagine running it through the air and reading every kitchen in the neighborhood. Bread here, coffee there, something burning 2 houses down. That sounds like science fiction to us. To a catfish, it is just an ordinary afternoon. The person who mapped this more carefully than almost anyone is John Caprio, a sensory neuroscientist at Louisiana State University, who spent a career on how a catfish tastes the water around it. His finding, put plainly, a catfish is essentially a swimming tongue. The taste receptors are not only in its mouth, they run across its whole body, head to tail. So when we argue about which scent works, the fish is answering that question with its skin. And what those receptors are tuned to is not some mystery cologne. It is amino acids, the building blocks of protein. Caprio's work showed catfish detecting certain amino acids at concentrations so low they are hard to even picture. Think one careful drop spread through a backyard swimming pool, and the fish still reads it. The ones that actually trigger feeding have names worth knowing. L-alanine, L-arginine, L-proline. Those are the words a fish understands. Not chartreuse, not June bug. Those. Now layer in something the lure wall would rather you forgot. A huge share of freshwater fishing happens in water you simply cannot see far into. Stained, stirred up, low light. And in that water, the eyes stop being the main instrument. The fish switches over to chemistry. You have been buying realistic paint jobs for a hunter who, half the time, is closing the last few feet with its nose. So watch what happens when a boiled noodle hits that water. Durum wheat is mostly starch wrapped around protein. Boil it, and the starch granules swell and burst. Picture thousands of tiny sponges splitting open at once, and the structure starts shedding water-soluble compounds, free amino acids among them, straight into the water. A live minnow, by contrast, is a sealed envelope. Its chemistry stays locked inside its tissues. To a passing fish, it is nearly silent, until something tears it open. The noodle is not silent. The noodle is broadcasting. Here is where I have to be straight with you, because the honesty is the whole point of this channel. A noodle does not outfish everything everywhere. That is exactly the kind of claim that should make you suspicious. What is true is narrower and more useful, in murky water, for fish that feed by smell. Your catfish, your carp, your bottom feeders. A cheap piece of pasta that leaks the right amino acids can match a live bait sitting there sealed, and embarrass a lure that was built to be seen in water where nothing can see it. That is not magic. That is just knowing which sense you are actually fishing to. So it is cheap, it is legal, and, for scent feeders in the water most of us actually fish, it can genuinely go toe-to-toe with what is hanging in your tackle box, which only makes the question in the title stranger. If a noodle is all that, why is half the country convinced it was banned? Let's deal with the question hanging in the title, because you came here for it. Was macaroni actually banned? Short answer, no. Not the way the rumor tells it. There is no federal ban on fishing a noodle, and there never was. In most states, in most inland water, a boiled piece of pasta is perfectly legal bait. California's rule book is blunt about it. The state's regulations explicitly allow treated and processed foods to be used as bait, with a short list of exceptions. A noodle on a hook is across most of the country completely legal. So where are the exceptions? They are real, and they are worth knowing. Plenty of states have artificial lure-only or fly-only water, usually set aside to protect wild trout. In those stretches, organic food bait is off the table, and not just macaroni. Corn is out, bread is out, marshmallows are out. Macaroni sits on that same line, for the same reason. It has nothing to do with the noodle being dangerous or unfair. It is a category, and the category is processed food, which means the ban in the title was never really a ban. So where did the story come from? Two places, and both are almost true, which is exactly why the rumor had legs. The first is a headline that made the rounds. Someone fined for baiting with macaroni and cheese. Sounds absurd, until you read the second line. He was not fishing. He was a hunter, illegally baiting bears, hauling buckets of the stuff into the woods to draw them in for an easy shot. A hunting violation, nothing to do with a rod. But the headline put macaroni and fine in the same breath, and the fishing world ran with it. The second is across the Atlantic. A lot of UK match fisheries genuinely do ban pasta, but read the fine print, and it is about chumming, not hookbait. Dumping pounds of cooked pasta into a lake to draw fish has a real downside. The uneaten carbohydrate settles on the bottom and ferments, and that fermentation pulls oxygen out of the water. That is a legitimate environmental rule about mass dumping. It says nothing about a single noodle on your hook. And here is the detail that quietly ends the whole conspiracy. A state agency, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, publishes its own little guide to supermarket baits, and cooked elbow macaroni is right there on it, recommended, for panfish. The same kind of agency the rumor imagines burying this is the one printing it on a handout. So no, it was not banned. It was unsold. And it turns out silence is a far more effective way to make something disappear than any regulation. One generation stops talking about it, and the next never hears it exists. One honest note before we move on, because it matters and the rules are not the same everywhere. Water by water regulations change, artificial only zones shift, and what is legal in your state may not be legal one county over. Check your local regulations before you tie anything on. That is not a disclaimer to cover myself. That is just how you keep your license. So it is legal, and it leaks the right signal. That still does not explain the strangest part. Why this noodle does its worst damage on the most heavily fished water in your area. The lakes everybody calls dead. For that, we have to talk about memory. You have probably heard that a fish has a 3-second memory. It is one of the most repeated lines in all of fishing, and it is simply false. Fish learn, and they hold what they learn for weeks, sometimes months. They remember locations, they remember pain. And on a pressured lake, that memory is the single biggest thing standing between you and a bite. Think about the water within an hour of any city, the reservoir where every bank has boot prints, and every fish has seen 10,000 lures. A bass on that water has been caught and released before. It felt the hook. And the thing it learned to associate with that hook was a profile and a vibration, the flash of a spinnerbait, the silhouette of a soft plastic worm, the particular rattle of a hard bait. Biologists call it conditioned avoidance, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Here is the everyday version. You know that one bend on your commute where everybody taps the brakes, not because there is a sign, but because the whole town knows a trooper sits there. Nobody slows on the other 10 bends. They slow on that one because they learned it. A pressured fish is doing the same thing with your tackle. It is not gone. It is just tapping the brakes every time it sees the profiles that have burned it before. Now hand that fish a boiled noodle. There is no learned association to trip, no flash it has been hooked on, no vibration it has been trained to flee, no plastic shape it has spit out a dozen times. The noodle does not announce itself to the cautious, learned part of the brain at all. It slips underneath it, quietly leaking the one signal that speaks to the older, hungrier part instead. This is food, and it is already broken open. That is the real reason a pantry item can humble a tackle box on hard water. Not because the noodle is superior tackle, because it is the one thing on that lake the fish has never been taught to fear. On fresh, lightly fished water, a good lure competes just fine. I am not going to tell you to throw your tackle in the trash. But on the beaten-down public stuff, where the fish have basically been to school on everything in your bag, that blank slate is the whole edge. It is the exact water most of us actually fish, close to home, hammered every weekend, the place you have started to assume is fished out. It is not fished out. It is just educated. But, and this is where most people lose it, none of that matters if you prepare it wrong. And the way it usually gets explained is exactly why half the internet is convinced macaroni bait is a myth. Before I show you the preparation, and it is the part everyone gets wrong, I pulled all of it onto a single page. The cue sequence, the rig, the short list of what to stop doing, and the sources, so you can check every claim in this video yourself instead of taking my word for it. It is built to tape inside your tackle box lid. Point your phone at the code on screen, and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me, because the preparation is the whole difference between the angler who swears by this and the one who tries it once and calls it a myth. So here is the part that separates the angler who swears by this from the one who quits, and almost everyone gets it wrong. Start with why preparation decides everything. The leak, the chemistry that does the work, comes from a soft, broken open interior. The hold, staying on the hook through a cast, comes from a firm enough outside. Get one without the other, and you have nothing. Too soft, and it flies off the hook, or the fish mouths it and spits it. Too hard, and the starch never opens enough to broadcast. You are aiming for the narrow middle. So here is the preparation. No secret stopwatch, no magic number. Anyone selling you a precise cooking time down to the second is selling you folklore. Boil standard elbow macaroni to a firm al dente. Cooked through, but with real bite left in it. The texture where it still holds its shape and grips a hook point. For elbow macaroni that is only a few minutes, the one way to know your stove is to pull a piece and bite it. A teaspoon of plain salt in the water firms the outer surface and helps it survive the cast. When it is there, drain it, and a quick cold rinse stops the cooking and locks the texture. Store it dry. That is the whole recipe. Now the rig, and this is nothing like rigging a plastic. A size 8 or size 10 wide gap hook. Keep your weight off the bait, if you can. No sinker within 1.5 feet of the noodle. A bottom feeder that feels a slug of lead through the line will drop the bait before it ever commits. They are reading resistance the whole time. Run the hook through the curved wall of the noodle, not down the hollow center, so both cut ends stay open to the water. Those open ends are the whole point. That is where the signal pours out. Bunch it up on the shank and you seal the tube, and you have just muffled the one thing it does well. Leave the point sitting slightly proud, so when a fish draws it in, the hook finds the corner of the jaw. Then comes the hardest part for anyone who grew up working a lure. You cast past your spot, let it settle to the bottom, and you do nothing. You leave it still. Give it a slow count, a minute or more, and let a scent cone build out from those open ends into the water. Every twitch you cannot resist is you tearing that cone apart before it forms. Once it has had time, give the rod tip one slow lift and let it settle back. That puffs a fresh pulse of chemistry out of the interior, like a wounded baitfish repositioning on the mud. Then wait again. Lift, settle, wait. And learn what the take feels like, because it will not feel like a strike. No thump, no sharp rap. What you will feel is slow, deliberate, sideways pressure, like someone reached over and gently leaned your rod tip to one side. That is the fish mouthing it, confirming the chemistry matches the texture. Do not jerk. Let it load until there is honest weight on the tip. Then sweep the rod sideways, low and to the side, not up. An upward set pulls a soft noodle straight back out of the mouth. A sideways sweep drives that wide gap hook into the jaw corner, where it holds. And there is one condition where this quietly becomes your best tool instead of your backup. Those flat, bright, high-pressure days when the whole lake seems to shut off and every boat is complaining the fish quit biting. The days a fast, flashy presentation gets ignored. A still, unweighted noodle asks nothing of a finicky fish. No flash to refuse, no speed to chase. Just a quiet scent trail reaching out to fish that have shut the door on everything else. I will not tell you the barometer alone decides the bite. The honest truth is that link is still argued over. But a slow, scent-first bait is the right answer on the days nothing else moves, whatever is causing it. 3 mistakes bury more macaroni anglers than anything else. 1. Cooking it to mush, so it will not stay on the hook and the fish spit it. 2. Crushing it onto the shank and sealing the open ends, so it stops broadcasting. 3. Setting the hook straight up and pulling it out of a mouth that had not fully closed. Fix those 3, and you have already beaten almost everyone who tried this once and quit. A word on the hook itself, because a wide gap point left proud is exactly the point that finds your thumb when you are not paying attention. Back it out of a fish carefully, mind your hands while you rig, and a pinch-down barb makes both easier and lets you release a fish clean. None of this works if you are bleeding or the fish is. Go back to the man from the start, the one who waited a career to tie on a noodle and then felt foolish for waiting. I think about him because nothing about that noodle was ever hidden from him. It sat on a grocery shelf the whole time, in plain sight, for the price of a single coin. What was missing was never the bait. It was the explanation, the reason it works. Nothing about a piece of macaroni has changed in the last 20 minutes either. Same starch, same protein, same coins out of the cup holder. What changed is that you can now see the half of fishing the tackle wall never put a price on. The chemistry a catfish reads with its skin, the memory that makes a pressured fish flee your best lure and ignore a quiet noodle, the fact that it was legal the whole time. That half was never on the wall, and now you know exactly why. Not because anyone buried it, because there was no way to sell it to you twice, and a thing that cannot be sold twice does not get a peg. I will be fair about the other side of it, because that is the deal on this channel. Those soft plastics you lose on a snag are made to last, which is fine, until they are sitting on the bottom of the lake you love for a very long time before they break down. That is a trade-off baked into the material, worth knowing when you decide what to throw. A boiled noodle is gone in days. I will let you weigh that one yourself. Here is where it leaves you. You are now one of the few people on your bank who knows what is actually happening under the water, and who knows the cheapest bait there is was quietly forgotten for reasons that had nothing to do with whether it works. If you would rather fish knowing what the shelf will never tell you, you already know which side of this you are on. Subscribe, and we will keep pulling the rest of it back into the light, one forgotten bait at a time.